Most people hear a headline like Trump just replaced the 401k and immediately start thinking in the wrong frame. They think the story is about a product, a new account, a new label, a new government brand name dropped on top of an old retirement problem. That is the surface. The deeper story is much more important. The deeper story is that the country is still struggling with one of the most uncomfortable truths in modern finance. Millions of people work hard every year and still never get properly connected to the one machine that has been compounding wealth for asset owners for generations. That is the real issue. Not whether a retirement vehicle is called a 401k, an IRA, a Roth, or something with a President S name attached to it. The real question is who gets plugged into the market and who gets left outside trying to build a future on wages alone while asset prices keep moving away from them. That is why I care about this story, not because I am mesmerized by branding, because retirement systems are really just pipelines. Pipelines that move labor income into capital ownership, pipelines that turn present sacrifice into future financial power, pipelines that allow a person S money to keep working when the person is no longer capable, willing, or healthy enough to keep working at the same pace. That is what a serious retirement system does. And for millions of Americans, especially lower income workers, gig workers, contractors, small business employees, and people whose jobs never came with polished benefits packages, that pipeline has never been built properly at all. That is the problem. A 401k is a fine machine for the people who have one, but the people who do not have one are not merely missing a tax wrapper. They are missing access to the compounding engine itself. That is a much more serious loss than most people realize. When you spend your life earning wages without a disciplined path into capital ownership, you live under a very different financial physics. Your paycheck arrives, it gets cut apart by expenses, and the remaining surplus, if any, must be protected from your own fatigue, from inflation, from emergencies, and from the constant temptation to use it for immediate relief instead of future compounding. That is a brutally hard game. The reason employer retirement plans matter so much is not simply that they are tax advantaged. It is that they automate discipline. Automation is one of the great hidden blessings in personal finance. A person can survive many things. What he often cannot survive is repeated dependence on willpower. Willpower is fragile, systems are stronger. A 401k, when it works well, hijacks the employee's best financial instincts before the money even becomes psychologically spendable. The contribution leaves payroll, the match appears, the account grows, time passes, the person may still make mistakes elsewhere, but that pipeline remains alive in the background. That is an enormously powerful design, which is why the people who lack access to it are not merely inconvenienced. They are structurally behind. Now, I want to be careful because accuracy matters more than excitement. President Trump did sign an executive order on the 30th of April, 2026, directing the Treasury to create Trumpera.gov, a federal website, intended to connect workers without employer, sponsored plans to private sector low-cost IRA options by the 1st of January, 2027. The order is linked to the Saver S-Match program, created earlier under Secure 2.0, which can provide up to $1,000 a year for eligible lower and middle-income workers who contribute to qualifying retirement accounts. This does not literally abolish the 401k, and it does not create a brand new government-run retirement account replacing every employer plan. What it does is try to widen the on-ramp into retirement saving and federal matching for workers who were previously outside the employer plan pipeline. Fay-Site Fay-Turn 218,528, View 0 Fay-Turn 218,528, View 1 Fay-Turn 218,528, View 2 Fay-Turn 218,528, View 3 Fay. That distinction matters enormously because if you misunderstand the mechanism, you will misunderstand the economics. This is not a story about one account killing another account. It is a story about a new distribution channel into markets. and distribution channels change systems more than slogans do. That is one reason I think the source document, although dramatic, is pointing at something real. The old retirement world was built around the employer. You worked at the right kind of company. The company offered a 401k. The employer may be matched. The payroll system did the work. That was the model. The trouble is that the labor market changed faster than the retirement system did. The country added more contractors, more freelancers, more small busyness employment, more fragmented work, more app-based work, more part-time work, and more job mobility. The old pipeline did not expand fast enough to catch them, so you ended up with a system where the people most likely to benefit from automation, low fees, and matching contributions were often the people with the strongest employers already. That is not just an administrative mismatch. That is a capital allocation inequality built into the structure of work. The source document makes this point in a rough but useful way by focusing on three things: access, fees, and portability. Those really are the right three pillars. Access matters because an account you cannot join does nothing for you. Fees matter because small annual drags become enormous over time. And portability matters because the labor market no longer rewards lifelong loyalty to one employer the way it once did. A retirement machine that cannot move with the worker is a machine built for an older labor world. That is why this new framework, if it works, could matter. Not because it is perfectly designed, because it acknowledges reality. The worker is more portable than the old retirement pipeline was willing to admit. Now let us talk about fees first, because fees are one of the quietest ways the ordinary saver gets robbed without ever feeling robbed. Most theft is easier to notice than this. If somebody physically took $20 from your wallet each week, you would be outraged. If a retirement plan extracts a percentage point or more of fees from the compounding process each year, many people barely notice because the loss is diffused through time and hidden inside returns they never got to keep. That is what makes fees so dangerous. They do not scream, they bleed. The source document uses a comparison that makes the point clearly. If someone contributes $500 a month for 30 years and earns solid market returns, a high fee structure can quietly divert well over $100,000 of final value relative to a lower fee alternative. The exact illustration in the source compares an average 401k style fee around 1.26% against a much lower 0.15% fee assumption, and shows how the difference compounds into a very meaningful loss. Fay file site, Fay turn 63 file 0 Fay. This is one reason I have such contempt for people who dismiss fees as a small detail. Nothing that compounds for 30 years is a small detail. Fees are negative compounding. They are the mirror image of the investor's own hope for gain. When you pay a high fee every year, you are not just paying a fee in that year, you are also forfeiting the future compounding that those dollars could have produced if they remained yours. That is why low-cost investing became such a revolution. Not because it was glamorous, because it allowed the saver to keep more of his own engine. So when a new retirement excess program talks about low-cost options, that is not a cosmetic feature. That is central. If the country is serious about getting people with modest incomes into retirement vehicles, then cost control is not a nice extra. It is the difference between a policy that helps households compound and one that simply routes a new class of savers into the waiting hands of financial middlemen. Now, the second issue is access. This is the real heart of the matter. About 56 million private sector workers lack access to employer-sponsored retirement plans, according to the Pew report Reuters cited, and the White House fact sheet separately points to tens of millions of workers without employer plans or employer matches. The AP and White House materials both describe the order as an attempt to connect those workers to private sector IRAs through Trumper.gov in time for the Saver-S match to begin in 2027. Base site Fader and 218,528 view 1 Fader and 218,528 view 2 Fader and 218,528 view 3 Fay. Those numbers should bother you, not because you need to feel morally indignant in some abstract policy sense, because you should immediately understand what they imply economically. If tens of millions of workers remain outside the main automated pipelines of retirement ownership, then tens of millions of workers are trying to build long-term financial security in a system where asset ownership keeps outrunning wage growth. That is a brutal asymmetry. I have always believed that the great divide in modern finance is not only between rich and poor, it is between people who are structurally connected to compounding and people who are not. Once you see that clearly, you stop looking at retirement accounts as boring paperwork. You start seeing them as transmission systems. And if you build a new transmission system, you do not merely create a product, you redirect capital flows. That is why this is not simply a retirement story. It is a stock market story, it is an inflation story, it is a political story, and it is, most importantly, a system design story. Now let us go one layer deeper. Why does the state want more people inside these pipelines? The charitable answer is that retirement insecurity is real and widening access is obviously good for households without employer plans. I believe that explanation is partly true. The more cynical answer is that governments like systems that keep households invested, asset prices supported, and social pressure reduced. I also believe that explanation is partly true. These are not mutually exclusive. In politics, the most successful policies often survive because they help households and help the system at the same time. A broader retirement access structure can do exactly that. It can increase the number of people saving. It can increase the amount of money regularly flowing into private assets. It can deepen public participation in the stock market. And because it links the worker's long-term hopes to market performance, it can also make citizens more psychologically invested in the stability of the asset system itself. That is not a conspiracy, that is how political economy works. The source document is strongest when it identifies this effect directly. More money directed into retirement accounts means, at the margin, more recurring demand for financial assets. Supply and demand still govern markets. More long-duration buyers entering through an easier access point can support valuations over time, even if that does not eliminate crashes or recessions. Fay Fallow-Site, Fay turns 63, file 0, Fay, that is a very important point. A retirement policy is not only a household savings policy, it is also an asset demand policy. This does not mean the market goes straight up forever. Anyone who says that is a fool, but it does mean that if you create or widen automatic channels through which more people continuously buy broad market exposure, you have increased the structural bid under the market that matters. 401, KS did this, IRAs did this, cheap brokerages did this, automatic payroll deductions did this, target date funds did this, and now a federal portal that channels uncovered workers toward low-cost IRA products with a federal match is trying to do a version of the same thing for a different segment of the population. That is why I say the product name is the least interesting part of the story. The really important part is that the state is trying to expand the shareholder pipeline. Now, the match itself deserves attention too, because matching contributions are psychologically powerful in a way ordinary tax deductions are not. A tax benefit is abstract. A match is vivid. When an employer says, you put in $1, I put in some amount too, people immediately understand the value. That is why matching works so well behaviorally. It reframes saving from sacrifice into leverage, and the Saver S match does something similar for lower income workers. The AP reporting makes the thresholds clear. The full $1,000 annual match applies to single filers under $20,500 with phased down benefits up to $35,500. And married filers can receive up to $2,000 jointly subject to their own income thresholds. The White House fact sheet describes it more broadly as up to $1,000 per eligible worker, and a key federal incentive for lower and middle income savers. Fay-Site Fay turn 218,528 view 2 Fay turn 218,528 view 3 Fay that matters because it attacks a real problem. People with lower incomes are often told to save more at the exact moment when life feels least savable. Their rent is heavy, their food bill is heavy, their transportation costs are real, and then some polite financial voice says, You should really think about compounding. That can feel insulting when you are fighting for monthly survival. A match changes the emotional math. It says the state will meet your effort partway. That makes the first step feel less lonely. And the first step is always the hardest part. But now we have to turn to the part of the source document that is both the most alarmist and the most revealing. How is this going to be paid for? That is the right question, even if many people ask it in the wrong tone, because every time the government offers free money, the serious investor should immediately ask free to whom, paid by what mechanism, and with what second-order consequences. The source document is blunt about this, and although it simplifies, it points toward a real issue. The federal government is already running large deficits, adding new outlays, even if modest relative to total budget size, still means some combination of more debt, less spending elsewhere, or more revenue. And because the administration is not moving in the direction of broad tax increases here, debt becomes the obvious financing route. Debt, in turn, raises the familiar question of who ultimately absorbs it and under what monetary conditions. Fay-Filocyte, Fay-Turn 63. File 0 Fay, this is where I want to be mature rather than theatrical. Not every government outlay is instantly hyperinflation. Not every dollar of additional deficit automatically destroys the currency. That kind of language is childish, but it is equally childish to pretend new commitments are costless. They are not. If the government borrows more, it increases the stock of claims on the future. If the central bank ultimately accommodates enough of that environment through easier financial conditions or balance sheet behavior, the purchasing power of the currency is pressured over time. Again, not necessarily tomorrow morning, but over time. This is why I've always found it useful to remember that the most expensive money in politics is free money, not because the recipient is wrong to take it, because the bill never disappears. It simply gets redistributed through the system. And in the modern American system, one of the most common ways that redistribution shows up is through asset inflation and purchasing power erosion. That is why the source document's deeper insight is stronger than its outer rhetoric. If more government-supported money enters retirement pipelines and markets, then two things can happen at once. Asset owners can benefit, and people relying mainly on wages and cash savings can still feel squeezed by the broader inflationary structure. That is the real split. It is not good policy or bad policy in some cartoon sense. It is a system that can widen access and still deepen the long-run divide between those connected to assets and those who remain primarily exposed to wages and idle cash. That is the point almost everyone misses. They think of these debates in partisan terms. I think of them in ownership terms. Who gets pushed toward ownership? Who remains outside? Who understands what is happening? Who does not? That is the real map. And if you understand that, then the investment implications become much clearer. A policy that expands access to retirement accounts and encourages more recurring contributions does not guarantee permanent bull markets. But it does reinforce a long trend that has already been shaping the United States for decades. The system keeps steering more and more household money toward financial assets. That means broad market exposure remains very important. This is why the source ultimately lands on instruments like VTI and SPY as examples. I've said it more carefully than the source does because no single ETF is salvation, but the broader logic is sound. If a country keeps widening the channels through which ordinary workers are converted into regular buyers of broad market products, then broad market products remain central places where that capital pressure expresses itself. Fay-Filocyte, Fay-Turn 63, File 0 Fay. That is the key. You do not need to know which exact asset gets the first incremental dollar. You need to understand the riverbed. Where is the money being channeled? Where is policy quietly pushing flows? Where is the average person being trained, nudged, matched, and incentivized to send future savings? That is how systems are read. Not by staring at one speech, by following the channel. This is why I think the most important shift in investor mindset is to stop asking whether a program is perfectly pure and start asking what it does to the structure of demand. Markets do not wait for moral purity. They respond to flows. If the new structure pulls more workers into low-cost retirement investing, then broad financial assets receive another layer of long duration support. At the same time, the financing side of the government's role can keep pressure on purchasing power, which means the person without assets still falls behind faster than he realizes. That is how modern systems often work. They tell the truth and the lie at the same time. The truth is that wider access to compounding is genuinely good. The lie is that this access comes without cost or without changing the underlying monetary environment in which those assets are priced. Both things are happening. And if you can hold both ideas in your head at once, you will understand the country much better than the average commentator does. Now, there is another layer here that matters, and almost no one talks about it properly: volatility. The source document is right that more money and more access do not eliminate crashes. If anything, more retail participation and more politically encouraged flows can increase volatility in the right conditions. The market will still overshoot, panic, reprice, and flush out weak hands. That is unavoidable. New money entering the system does not abolish business cycles. It just changes who is exposed to them and how often. Fay file site, Fay turn 63, file 0, Fay. That matters because many people hear more money into the market and think it means easy gains. It means the long-term bid can grow while the short-term path remains violent. That is why I have always believed that the real winners in asset systems are not simply the first buyers. They are the buyers who can survive the volatility without breaking. This is where retirement systems help again. Automation makes endurance easier. When contributions are systematic, downturns become accumulation periods rather than moral tests. That is one reason the smartest thing about good retirement design is not the tax feature, it is the behavioral feature. It lets people keep buying when their emotions would otherwise tell them to stop. And that, over decades, matters more than almost any single market call. This is also why I think lower income access matters beyond the moral dimension. A worker who gets matched into the market year after year is not just building retirement assets. He is building asset literacy. He begins to understand that the economy is not something happening out there to other people. He owns a part of it. That psychological shift matters. People behave differently when they own. They pay more attention. They start seeing the connection between policy, inflation, taxes, fees, and assets. And that change in self-perception can matter almost as much as the account balance itself. That is why this is such an important moment. Not because the executive order itself solves everything. It does not. Not because it literally replaces the 401k. It does not. But because it reveals that retirement policy is moving further toward a universal market, access question rather than a workplace, benefits question alone. That is a very important transition. If the old world said your retirement pipeline depends on your employer, the new world is moving toward your retirement pipeline should travel with you and the state may increasingly help route you into it. That is a much larger idea than people appreciate. And larger ideas tend to have larger second-order effects. Some of those effects are good: more access, lower costs, greater portability, more recurring market participation. Some of those effects are more ambiguous: more debt, potentially more inflation pressure, more dependence on asset market stability, a deeper divide between owners and non-owners. That is the whole truth, not the clean little version. And once you see all of that, you realize the real lesson is not partisan at all. The real lesson is that in modern America, the state increasingly understands something the average household still resists emotionally. You cannot build a stable society if too many people remain permanently cut off from the ownership engine. That is what this is really about. Not just retirement ownership. Ownership is the stabilizer. Ownership is what lets capital do some of the work your body used to do. Ownership is what lets compounding begin turning years into something larger than a string of paychecks. And ownership is exactly what millions of workers were missing because the old pipeline was too employer-centered for the labor market that actually exists. Now, that is why I think the right response to this whole Trump IRA story is neither celebration nor contempt. It is recognition. Recognition that the country is trying, imperfectly and politically and noisily, to widen the ownership machine. Recognition that this can help households and also support asset prices. Recognition that free money is never really free, but can still change behavior powerfully. Recognition that low costs matter enormously. Recognition that broad market ownership remains central in a system designed to keep routing more savings there. And recognition that if you still rely only on your paycheck while the state keeps widening the capital pipeline for everyone else, you are living in the wrong side of the economic system. That is the final point. The great divide is not left or right. It is not 401k or ERA. It is not traditional or Roth. The great divide is whether your money is being quietly and repeatedly connected to productive assets, or whether you are still living in a world where your labor shows up alone every month and has to carry your future by itself. That is the thing I want people to understand. Once you see it clearly, the headline becomes much less interesting than the machine underneath it, and that machine is what matters, because names come and go, presidents come and go, programs expand, get renamed, get litigated, get modified, or get copied, but the underlying reality remains: who owns productive assets wins, who stays outside the ownership pipeline falls behind. And every policy that widens access to ownership, however politically messy, changes the shape of the market and the shape of the country at the same time. That is why this matters. Not because Trump replaced the 401k, because America is still, one way or another, pushing more people into the market and asking capital ownership to solve problems wages alone could not solve. That is the real story. And if you understand that, you stop reacting like a spectator. You start thinking like an owner.